The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Hello, welcome to the 92nd Street Y. I don't know if this mic is on, but I think you can hear me. I'm Jennifer Hausler, Assistant Director of the lecture program here at the Y, and I'm very excited to welcome Steve Earle here tonight. He'll be in conversation with Anthony DeCurtis, and they'll be taking your questions, and we're also selling his new CD, Washington Square Serenade, in the hall outside, so you can get a copy, and I'm sure he'd be happy to sign it. I also want to tell you about our website, 92y.org. You can go there and sign up for regular updates. We're constantly adding programs. So we have Ani DeFranco coming up in December, and a lot of exciting things planned. Anthony DeCurtis is a contributing editor at Rolling Stone. He's the author of Rocking My Life Away, Writing About Music and Other Matters. And in other words, artists talk about life and work. That's a collection of his interviews. He won a Grammy Award in the Best Album Notes category for his essay accompanying the Eric Clapton retrospective Crossroads. He's a member of the nominating committee for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and he teaches in the writing program at the University of Pennsylvania and the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism. Please welcome Anthony DeCurtis.
I'd love to. We literally will not stand on ceremony tonight. Is this okay? It is really just such a great pleasure for me to introduce tonight's guest. The first time I ever interviewed Steve Earle was back in the early 80s when I was living in Atlanta. And Steve came through and was did a great show at a place called the Moonshadow Saloon. And afterwards, I was talking to him, and I was really struck. I was really taken by him as anybody who hears his music is. But I remember one of the questions I asked him was, what do you want from this? What would you like to have people say about you? And he said, well, I really wish that one day there would be just something, whether it's a lick or a type of song that somebody would say, that's a Steve Earle song, or that's how Steve Earle does it. And I think probably everybody in this room, and certainly I, have a sense of what a Steve Earle song is at this stage of the game. And something, as I would describe it, I think it's just something that conveys a tremendous amount of passion, tremendous amount of poetic force, and a tremendous amount of social, political, and personal conviction. I think Steve has made all of those things his hallmark, and of course have an extraordinary career as a songwriter, a performer, a playwright, and a fiction writer, and of course someone who, and a recording artist. Somebody who whose body of work is just one of the great achievements in the last quarter century of songwriting. So he's got a new album out, as I'm sure many of you know. He'll be happy to sign it for you. After we're going to talk for a while, and then we're going to open up the conversation, and hopefully you'll have some questions for him. And I'm just delighted to bring out Steve Earle. Well, see, one of the particular pleasures of this evening is that on your new record and in your actual lived life, has become a kind of celebration of New York. And I wonder if you could talk about coming here and just what the idea of New York meant to you. New York is kind of an idea as much as it is a place,
Yeah.
Yeah, what was the first time you ever formed a kind of notion about it and that eventually brought you to Fair 10?
Literally off the back of, album covers, liner notes. I can remember, and it's weird because I live in the Village, and I literally walk down streets that I read off the back of album covers for the first time or heard in song lyrics. And, I started playing guitar like in 1967 or 66 or 67. I started trying to play before that, and I'm sorry. But I was using my uncle's guitar, who is 5 years older than me, and he played left-handed, so it was hard to learn upside down. And after he moved out of the house and gave me his guitar, the process sort of accelerated, and that was literally 1967. And the first record I bought I got all his records before that. So, and they were good records. They were like Beatles records and Rolling Stones records and Kinks records. And then Sgt. Pepper was the first record I had to go into town and buy, and myself. And I had to wait till we were in San Antonio because I lived in a little place called Shirts, and you could get singles there, but you couldn't get LPs, and because you can get singles at the dime store. And but I wanted to sound like Jimi Hendrix and Cream, but my dad wouldn't let me have a fucking electric guitar, and so I started, I noticed that some Beatles songs and some Stones songs, there were acoustic guitars on them, and I could make my guitar sound like that. And that just sort of, there was some really good acoustic music around, stuff that I learned later had come out of, something that happened in New York City, which was I know several people that were directly involved that still refer to it as the folk scare, and people that still live in that neighborhood. And I backtracked from like Crosby, Stills and Nash records and Tim Buckley and Tim Hardin and all that stuff. And then Dylan for me began originally with Bringing It All Back Home and Highway 61. But then I had a drama teacher in high school, and it was probably the only teacher I had that I didn't hate, and definitely the only one that didn't hate me. And we were doing. It was what would have been my second attempt at a freshman year in high school, because I ran away from home and dropped out in the middle of the first time, and they told me I could come back and start again next year. And I wasn't going to come back, but my grandmother bought me my first Gibson guitar as a bribe to get me to go back, and I went back for about 2 months, and then I dropped out again anyway. But before I dropped out, we did a show called The World of Carl Sandburg, which is a review that actually was on Broadway of Carl Sandburg poetry and songs from the American Song Bag. Now, the two most important collectors of folk songs before as far as on a printed page. The most important collector of folk songs was probably Harry Smith, who he had this incredible record collection, and that probably had a lot more of an impact. But before Harry Smith and the Anthology of American Folk Music, what people had were two collections: one that Carl Sandburg had collected himself, and one that the Lomaxes, that Alan Lomax and his father had collected. So I did that show, and it was Carl Sandburg poetry. It was a review, and then songs from the American Song Bag. And somewhere in that process, this teacher, his name was Vernon Carroll, he said, "This is the Bob Dylan record that you need to be listening to, man." And it was the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. And then all of a sudden I started hearing these melodies that I'd heard someplace before. And because that's, at that point in Dylan's development, he, was still, and he wasn't the only person to do it. It was the beginning of my job. It was the beginning of, the modern singer-songwriter. He was using melodies that existed. That was part of that folk process. And keep in mind, I think this is really important. Dave Van Ronk, who was around at the time too, really liked to make a big, he liked to point out that there's folk singers and then there's singer-songwriters, and that they're two different things, that once Dylan became a singer-songwriter, he wasn't a folk singer anymore. I think Van Ronk was brilliant. He's one of my heroes, but I think he was just wrong about that. And but this thing did start, people started writing songs in those styles. So I kept getting connected back to New York over and over and over again, just for music that I listened to. So I all of a sudden, I actually intended to come in Texas, who had been here and made he made his first 2 records here, and met the criminal that would make most of the money from his career, from his efforts here. And then I got married when I was 19 years old, and I ended up getting, as several people that I knew from Texas had settled in Nashville by that time, and I literally my wife's family invited her to go to Mexico, to San Miguel Allende, and they didn't invite me, and which pissed me off. So I decided to go on a reconnaissance mission, and I was coming to New York then, but I got as far as Nashville, and I ran into a guy named Richard Dobson, and that I knew from Texas, and Robert Altman was filming the movie Nashville, and there were dime hot dogs in the park to get a crowd sing together, and I ran out of money, and I was there 32 years. Mainly because I wasn't there very much, and I came here as soon as I started making records, and actually I came here before I came here playing bass for Guy Clark the very first time that I came, and played the bottom line with Guy, but it was always one of my favorite places. It was one of my favorite places when I was doing well. It was one of my favorite places when I wasn't. I knew at least this island better than was good for me during the 80s, when it was a fundamentally different place. Some parts of it were not necessarily better, it was just different, and it was always a place I was really attached to and that I always felt at home. But Tennessee was cheaper, it was easier to maintain infrastructure and a band and all of that stuff, and I, like I said, I wasn't there very much, so the Republicans didn't bother me all that much, so I was able to stay there for a long time. Well, it's both. I mean, the records, obviously, if you had an acoustic guitar in 1967 or 68, a lot of the music that you'd get a hold of would be, actually, a lot of the period was political. I grew up during the Vietnam War. I don't remember that war not being on television. By the time it was over with, I was old enough to be drafted, and it was my ass on the line, so I was out in the street. There's no one my age. I'm 52. I'll be 53 in January. No one my age. There's no one, even 7 or 8 years older than me, 7 or 8 years younger, who's, grew up in this country, whose life isn't largely defined by that war. It made us what we are. That's why we're still making art about it. And we're still talking about it. We didn't learn anything, and we made the same mistake again. But that, that needs to be open for discussion too. I think a lot of it was an accident. I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, 5 Air Force bases, Fort Sam Houston, the Vietnam War going on. I was too young to play places that served liquor when I started playing when I was 14, so that meant coffee houses. Coffee houses were in San Antonio, Texas, which there was one commercial one, which was downtown. It's called the Gatehouse. And then, believe it or not, the other 3 gigs were actually 2 in San Antonio, and they were both on military bases, literally in the service clubs, because the Army, they were too busy trying to, wipe out the population of Southeast Asia to worry about somebody just put in a requisition and said they wanted a PA system. They wanted to have a coffee house, a service club too, and it took them 2 years to shut us down. And even though the the Fort Sam Houston chapter of Vietnam Veterans Against the War was chartered at Service Club 2, and I watched it happen. My first trouble I ran into, my father was an air traffic controller. He worked for the federal government. So if you're military personnel, which a lot of my friends were, or worked for the government, and you got into trouble with the law, there was a really good chance the way the police knew that they could put pressure on you and make you behave by getting in touch with your father's commanding officer or the equivalent thereof, because it was kind of a government town. And I ended up on television singing "Feel Like I'm Fixing to Die" rag on a flatbed truck in front of the Alamo, and my father wasn't working a midnight shift for a change, and he actually got to see the news, and he saw it, and all hell broke loose. Because he heard about it at work. It was a really politically charged atmosphere, and this sort of I learned to play literally in these places. The local underground newspaper was published upstairs. It's called the Eagle Bone Whistle, and there were I was kind of raised politically by people that they were giving me Emma Goldman and Karl Marx, and I'd read it, and sometimes I would understand it, and sometimes I wouldn't, but I always remembered to go back to it, and it was just it was a really politically charged atmosphere in the middle of rampant redneckism, and it's 1969, and I've responded to it. Well, this record there's a lot of people that are probably getting the record because it came out last week now. People that buy every record I put out, and there's just enough of them out there that I haven't had to get a job, and I love them. That will tell you this record is less political than its predecessors. I can't argue with that. It's less overtly political than the two records before it, but there's a reason for that. The Revolution Starts Now was written, I literally jammed. I'd written Jerusalem, I'd written that record and put it out, which was sort of my 9/11 response. And I wrote the songs of The Revolution Starts Now because I'd already written Rich Man's War, and I'd already written The Revolution Starts Now, and I wanted them out before the election. And I called Danny Goldberg, who's my manager now, but in those days, Danny ran a record label called Artemis that I recorded for 10 years. And we'd been in cahoots politically off and on for a long time anyway, long before we were working together and stuff that concerns my day job. And when do I have to deliver a record to get it out for the election? He said, well, you need to deliver it in like May or April or May. And April's better than May. He wanted a little setup time on the record. And he totally supported that. I was finally recording for somebody. Don't get me wrong. I made the kind of records that I wanted to make. People tried to tell me what kind of record to make, and sometimes I would smile and I would agree with every word they said to do whatever the fuck I wanted to do anyway. I wasn't, it never changed the way I made records. But I've had the luxury for the last 10 years of being able to make records the way I wanted to, completely and totally supported as an artist and as a citizen of a democracy by the record label that I recorded for. And so I felt obligated to say some of the things that I said on those two records because not everybody was getting that kind of support. We didn't need a blacklist this time, folks. We didn't need, we didn't need censorship. Artists were censoring themselves. Artists were so, and it wasn't an accident. It wasn't because they weren't brave. It was because everything around them, created an atmosphere of fear, and we were not being. It was being suggested by people that there was something that artists were cheating their audience if they interjected their political beliefs into it. And I don't think I care particularly what Britney Spears thinks about politics, but I'm not fucking Britney Spears. And, you know, it's not, when I say, I just thought that that's what an artist is supposed to do. This record was me needing to make a record for myself. So it's probably less political, but there's some pretty political stuff on it. But it's mainly love songs for Allison Moore and New York City. And I needed to make a record that was a little more intimate. I needed to make a record that was, you know, I do this for me too. And I do it for, you know, what art is to me more than anything else is if I can reveal something about myself, whether it's political or whether it's personal, and, you know, that, in other words, tell you about how I feel or show you how I feel, you know, by painting or by writing, you know, evoke a feeling, and let you know that you're not alone. I mean, people talk about, you know, political songs. Well, don't you realize you're preaching to the choir? Well, that's not always true. 3 times I've had people come up and say that something that I wrote changed their mind about a political issue. Now, that's 3 different times. Oh, it absolutely is. It's my job. Yeah, they sing. That's exactly it. It's about you know, whether it's a love song or whether it's a song about getting your heart broken or whether it's a song about standing up for something that you believe in. As human beings, we need to know that there's other people out there that feel the same way that we do. That's what art does. That's what it does better. And music, you know, I think for the last few generations may just happen to do that better than anything else. It's just it's a really easy to consume form of art. I mean, we grew up and you know, we're a couple of generations that grew up in our cars. You know, literally it's art that you can consume when you're driving your car. I mean, pop music doesn't have to be art. And I don't, you know, nobody has to make a political statement. I think it's just as wrong to tell people to harangue people because you think they're not saying enough. People can only say what they're willing to say, what they're committed to saying, and what seems true to them at the time. That's part of an artist's job too, is to be true to themselves. Sure. Oh, you don't need to get out of the way. You stay right there. This is let's see. Oh, we can turn that down just a hair, just because this vocal mic's not gonna be that loud. So. We'll leave it like that then. Instead of that. Allison pulled a Jimmy Reed there. It's like Jimmy Reed's wife used to stand behind him like What I mean in this song, or just it was the idea of this record exists for all the right reasons. I mean, I think for an artists have to do records like I made a bluegrass record for almost the same reason artistically that I made this record about 10 years ago. I just really needed to operate outside of my comfort zone. I'd never made a record in New York. I was living here, and there was some necessity. I was sort of separated from a recording studio that I've worked in more or less the same way for 10 years. And then I tested positive for Pro Tools finally, which is this software that everybody else has been making records in for a long time, and I just never did it because I had a really good analog, I had a couple of really good analog tape recorders and a really good studio, but right now, at this point in time, folks, there's no tape being manufactured anywhere in the world. So I was coming to a point where, there's rumors that there's people that are going to make tape, and that there was a time a year and a half ago when there was no tape. So it was either learn a new way to make records or stop making records, and I'm not ready to stop making records. So it was then Allison and I. People make a big deal out of the fact that my drug habit is a big part of what defines me to some people, and the fact that I've been married a lot of times is a lot of what defines me to a lot of people. Truth of the matter is, it's been 13 years since I took any drugs, and I've made more records sober than I ever made, high. And I've never been married sober before. It's been a long time since I got married, so it's a completely different experience. So I was, and this marriage was like, neither one of us saw this coming. We'd known each other around Nashville for a while, and then Allison, I actually started, Garrison Star's here tonight, and she was, the first of several people. Actually, my sister was first, Garrison was second. I started taking girls that sang really good out as opening acts so that they could sing duets with me on my show. And Allison, came when the Revolution Starts Now started. She came out to do to be the opening act on the tour, and she was just finishing up, touring to support her record, which came out, before mine did. And we went to Europe, and all hell broke loose, and everybody, people started having to find other places to live. It was, neither one of us saw it coming. I think we were completely and totally blindsided, but it was, and there was never any doubt that we were going to get married. It was okay. We have some other business we have to sort out first. It was just kind of a mess, but that was always the intention. And having been through it and failed for myself, I think. I had the idea of doing it in the place that I'd lived for 30 years around the same people, and actually, driving up and down the same streets, even living in the same house that some of that history happened in, didn't seem like a great idea. And also, I had finally married a girl with a job, so I could afford to move to New York, and it was, and just barely. I had a radio show in Air America at the time that I just started, and that sort of made the difference. That and Allison having an income, and we started looking, and it gave us this is a place for us, for us to kind of start out without, we kind of have this city to ourselves, and as weird as that sounds, in the place is bigger than New York. It's a place that neither one of us have ever lived on our own. Well, I mean, it's funny because, I've been thinking about this recently, talking about this record and talking about folk music again. But one of the things about the Beatles is it was a form of folk music. I mean, that kind of, the idea of a band that was two guitars and bass and drums was music that was accessible and was much more accessible. People thought it was going to go away. People were saying in England at the time that the Beatles were signed that, guitar bands are getting ready to go away. That's about over with. We're going to go back to larger bands with, with brass and strings. And the reason that never happened, in England, growing up where they grew up, they were getting the best of American music, but they couldn't escape being English. And so it got its own spin. And they had country music, and they had, that was the thing that always fascinated me. The Beatles were hard for me to, they were my favorite band because everything was there. There were acoustic guitars on the Beatles records. They kind of always were from very early on. And I could make my guitar sound like the Beatles sometimes. And it's just, I literally, part of it's my age. I saw them all. I saw every single one of those Ed Sullivan performances when I was 8. That's what year that was, So I was 9, I guess. And it was, my uncle was 5 years older than me. He moved in with us by the time he was in high school. So by the time, Revolver and no, actually by the time Rubber Soul came out, he was living in my house. So he went out and got the records when they came out. He was my hero in every way. He was my hero for when it came to fashion and records and as soon as he got a 12 string and he gave me his first guitar so I could turn the strings over, then I actually could learn how to play. But I was trying to be. At first, Nick was trying to be the Beatles, and I was trying to be Nick. But then Nick moved out, and I was sort of left there in the summer of '67 to sort of figure things out for myself. And the Beatles, we waited for every release. And think about this. The other night we were talking about trying to figure out. Sgt. Pepper came out in the summer of '67, and what came out at Christmas that year? The much maligned for no fucking reason Magical Mystery Tour. As a record, that's like it only has I Am the Walrus on it and Hello Goodbye. And it's slightly different here than it was in England. In England, it was the television show I've seen. It was truly dreadful. There's no doubt about that. But the music, I don't think ever suffered. And it's become fashionable to slag off on the White Album. I'll never forget that. The White Album had a lot of stuff that sounded like my guitar. I learned how to... By that time, I was the obnoxious kid that went around with a guitar on his back all the time. It's what it's what defined me more than anything else. And my father was horrified that I expected him to pay $8 for a double album. That's what the White Album cost. It's good, $8. And I think I got my first real stereo that year when that was because I had Nick's record player. At some point he came back and got it. So I had this. I was literally playing Rolling Stones and Beatles and Kings records on my little red flip up mono. And then I actually got a stereo. I think that year when the White Album came out. But there was it all the way up into the Beatles finally stopped making records when I was a freshman in high school. It was like a long, slow death that went on into 1970. But it's funny. Me and this friend of mine named Jim Warren. I was doing really, really badly in school, and it was obvious I wasn't going to be, a lawyer or nothing. And I really didn't know that I could make a living necessarily playing music, but it was all I was interested in doing. And all we did, we spent, all summer long, and then all of a sudden, I wasn't going to schooling, which I sort of had the fall and the winter too, to sit around, drinking, Ripple and singing, learning how to sing Beatles songs with an acoustic guitar in the park, and then Crosby, Stills and Nash songs. We were really fascinated with harmony. But I don't think to this day, no one's made it. Later on, I had a recording studio, for 10 years that with a friend of mine named Ray Kennedy, and we made, we produced some really good records there. I had a label for a while, and the records that I made over the last 10 years, Listen to Williams, that Carwell's on the Gravel Road, we made that record there. And everything we did was, if you were ever in the studio, it was a Beatles shrine. Everything, we literally had microphone preamplifiers that came out of Abbey Road too. And, they worked great and they sounded great. They had Beatle electrons in them, and we were so, everything I've done as a recording artist up until this record, because my priorities shifted, was about, when it came to making records, was based on the idea, and I still believe this, no one has ever made records that sound any better than the records that were recorded in Abbey Road and in Olympia and a handful of other studios by the Beatles between 1964 and, 63, they were making those records so fast they didn't get the benefit. The gear was really great though, and once they became a priority and got the time in the studio, and they invented it. They invented, the art form of making LPs, of pop bands. LPs before the Beatles, were jazz and Broadway tunes, and it took even the Beatles couldn't convince the music business here that it was here to stay. It took seeing 400,000 kids in a cow pasture in upstate New York for the music business here to finally snap and decide that there was money in it and to start shifting, the rock and roll business. So they were, you can't play music in the period that I learned how to do it and not, it'd be tough not to be a Beatles fan. And the idea of being a Stones fan versus a Beatles fan, who knows, why the Stones survived. I think my theory's always been, and I'm a huge Stones fan too, I don't like, maybe the Stones survived, possibly, this is a theory, by narrowing their focus a little bit. But trust me, when they were making, one of my favorite Stones records is Flowers, which actually doesn't exist in England. It's a compilation of B-sides and stuff, but it's got, Have You Seen Your Mother, Baby, Ruby Tuesday. It's got, the first song I learned how to play was, I learned on acoustic guitar was, my mother came running from the front of the house, and my advice is if your children are learning to play guitar, don't let them learn their first song in a minor key because it'll fuck them up. But it was, during that period, and that's still one of my favorite Rolling Stones periods, is the Backstreet Girls on that record. They were trying to be the Beatles. Trust me, they wanted to be the Beatles. They wanted to be as big as the Beatles, and their Satanic Majesty's Quest it's not a joke. So they were serious as a heart attack. And trust me, they were hanging out with the Beatles and hanging on every single word.
Well, the phenomenon devotion. One of the things I think that even though
I made it in the studio that Hendrix built, and I made it in Electric Lady, which is 4 blocks from my apartment, and I could walk to work. And he never finished it, but he did record there. He recorded 31 tracks there, and then he went off to, literally with Eddie Kramer soldering all around him the entire time he was recording. And then he went to England for Isle of Wight, and he hung out for a while, and he never came back. And the murals are still there that he commissioned. He saw the drawings for them. But he never actually saw them completed. But it's there's good ghosts there. There's something there that if you I thought this might be creepy because I've been in some places that in the world that were historically important to me, but I didn't stay in them very long because they creeped me out. But it doesn't feel that way there. It's like everybody, a lot of great records have been made there since, and you go in and you feel like, I think what's happened is a lot of people understood what potentially could have happened there if Hendrix had just come back from England on that trip, and what we all lost. And I think everybody that ever records in there goes in and tries to do whatever they can to sort of make up for that. And but he was like, if you can imagine, he changed everything. I don't think it's an accident. I think Eric Clapton had to wait for Jimi Hendrix to die before he would pick up a Stratocaster. He's been playing them ever since. I've always believed that. He played every guitar in the world until Hendrix is gone, and he's played nothing but Strats ever since. Yeah, let's see if I can get this thing. Well, that it should be, unless.
The rest of the country is going to listen to idiots like those dogs. And, I don't think the dogs people.
I just think he's, gets the ratings and the response. He does a show that really started out as basically a show about economics. Shipped away to other places.
walk out my front door and see like a mixed race same-sex couple holding hands, because it makes like my white heterosexual ass feel safer in this particular religion. Allison Moore.
Thanks.
Well, I also, there's a lot of people that work. There's a lot of people that work against the death penalty in this country. They've been doing it for a long time, and they're still out there doing it. And I've neglected that issue because since the war started, because it's been hard not to. I mean, it's still my main area of activism, but I can't ignore this war. So I get asked to do things, and it seems like you couldn't ignore anything as big as this war, but we're doing it, and that's kind of how it got the way it is. It's just people ignoring it. And the death penalty, though, is I'm opposed to the death penalty for exactly the same reasons that I'm opposed to this war. I got involved in it. This is really weird. It's another. I grew up in Texas, and we didn't execute any more people than anybody else in the southern United States did before the death penalty went away. The death penalty died of natural causes in this country in the 70s, and we officially had no death penalty for about 14 months, in between late 1971 and 1973. Basically, I saw In Cold Blood, the film, when I was, I guess it played, it was on television, it wasn't in the theater, and it kind of blows my mind that now when I think about, what my perception of everything else in terms of art, that was going on around me and what filtered through to San Antonio, Texas, but I saw In Cold Blood, and what stuck with me originally and caused me to go out and, I was I guess I was 12, because I think In Cold Blood came out in 67. I mean, the film, the radio, the movie was 67. But I already, I went out and found the book, and I read it. But what caused me what stopped me in my tracks is the one scene where they're getting ready to execute Terry Smith at the end of the film, and he goes second. They've already executed his charge partner, and he asks if he can be let out of the harness. They've got this really elaborate harness on him, and you saw it virtually the same scene, in these two movies that have been made about Truman Capote's relationship with these inmates. And he wants to go to the bathroom because he's heard that he's going to be hung, and he's heard that one of the things that happens when you hit the end of the rope is that you soil yourself, and he thinks that he can prevent that by going to the bathroom at the last minute. And he's told that there isn't time, and it takes a priest begging for them to hurry and let him go to the bathroom, and then they strap him back up, and then they hang him. I don't know why, but even growing up watching John Wayne movies and liking them as much as anybody else, and seeing a lot of violence, growing up in kind of a cowboy culture, where the guys that everybody looked up to were pretty violent. That for some reason seemed inhumane on a really fundamental level that I didn't even have words for when I was 12 or 13 years old. And it was just it struck me when I was 12 that doing this diminishes us. and you know, I couldn't put my finger on how or why, but years later, you know, I was already had a heroin habit that would eventually get me locked up, but I was a few years away from that happening. And you know, they started executing people in Texas, and it's my home state. My mother was living in Humble, Texas, which is really close. It's only 40 miles from Huntsville. And she would, when they finally started executing people in the 80s, it would keep her up at night. And I'd talk to her on the phone, and you know, my mother's pretty nocturnal to this day, and you know, so I could get a hold of her late, and it always bothered her. She was always very hyper aware of it when the executions were going on, and they started being more and more frequent. It got to the point where Texas at one point was averaging 4 executions a month. Now, I, for some reason, just responding to that, wrote a song called Billy Austin, which was on a record called The Hard Way, which I made in 1990. And, you know, it's a first-person account of, it's a guy telling his story, and he's not innocent, he's not wrongfully convicted, he's guilty of a heinous crime. But he's just basically telling his story how he got there, and he is sort of pointing the finger a little bit, you know. It is that sort of less than subtle form of protest song in its own way. I mean, it's definitely, you know, it was the first song. I've written 3 songs about that issue, you know, and over the years, and but people started writing me I started getting these letters that with a stamp on them that saying that they'd been censored, you know, they'd been, you know, people had read them, and you know, with numbers under guys' names, and it was guys on death row started writing me, and a lot of them were in Texas because most of the people on death row at that time in the United States were in Texas, and I basically was asked one time by an attorney called me in Alabama, and in Tennessee actually the first one, and said that he wanted me to talk to, that he had a client that he was representing who was waiving his appeals. He was what they call a volunteer. He was waiving all of his appeals to have his execution moved up. And he had heard me say in an interview that when volunteers, you know, when people had their names moved up, they also moved other people, you know, up in line to be executed in their home states. And once, you know, there hadn't been that many executions in states outside of Texas. And once you started executing, you know, once we get blood on our hands, it becomes easier. And it's not them. You know, my opposition to the death penalty is pretty fundamental. I'm not trying to save anybody on death row. I knew 11 guys on death row around the United States. They're all dead now. Every single one been executed. And I don't get close to inmates anymore because, well, for a lot of reasons. The main one being that they finally I witnessed an execution because I was asked to, and I didn't know how to say no to a dying man's last request. And it damaged me. It damaged me for life. And, but make no mistake, that damage was overt, and it's actually in some ways easier to deal with, I believe, than the damage that happens to all of us, because what I came away from that experience with that blew my mind was the amount of empathy that I had for the other people in the room whose job was to take an otherwise healthy person, take him in, and no matter how loud he screamed and how hard he fought, which John didn't do, you know, but if he had, they were going to execute him that night, one way or the other. And it just dawned on me that everybody from the warden who had to stand there and the priest, they were all taking, you know, this big hit, this huge damage to their spirit on behalf of us. Because it's not them killing people, it's us killing people. My opposition to the death penalty is based on one concept. If the government, I still believe this is a democracy, and I really need to believe this is a democracy to stay here. In a democracy, if my government kills someone, then I'm killing someone, and I simply object to the damage that does to my spirit. I'm taking care of myself. I'm not trying to save anybody else on death row. There is a point. I mean, I believe that you know, the issue here is retribution. The death penalty is retribution. And nowadays, we're completely and totally unapologetic about that. We're told that we do it to provide closure for victims' family members. And, I've known some victims. I spent several years traveling around the country with an organization called Journey of Hope and Violence to Healing, which came out of Murder Victims Families for Reconciliation, two groups. And these are organizations of thousands of people who are murder victims' family members. A loved one was killed in a violent crime, and they choose to deal with their grief by traveling around the country speaking against the death penalty. That's where the phrase "not in my name," that didn't begin with the Nyon statement when this war started. That phrase had been going around in activism circles against the death penalty in this country for 15 years that I know of for sure. And it's one of those things. It's still they just executed my last guy in Tennessee about 6 months ago, and he wouldn't speak to me anymore. He got mad at me because, like I said, no innocent guys ever wrote. All my guys were only guilty guys write me, so none of my guys were ever innocent. And so I didn't speak to the last guy I had for several years because these guys were criminals. I mean, most of them, and they were manipulative, and they were making a last stand. And they didn't. You had to. I've seen a lot of damage happen to activists that got too close to inmates and were manipulated by inmates. That's a danger. It's like really, it's hard work. If you ever decide that you want to work against the death penalty in this country, I encourage that and I support that. But I also have to warn you: take very, 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 very good care of yourself and listen to people that have been around doing it for a long time, and don't try to reinvent the wheel. There's reasons why. There's some people that there's people that I disagree with that are opposed to the death penalty. But one thing I do know for sure, because I have one experience that most of them don't have, and that's I've sat from me to this gentleman in the blue shirt right here and watched a guy die that wasn't going to die that night one way or the other. And I watched him. I heard him singing "Silent Night," and because he was singing it for his mother because he'd finally gotten a hold of her after trying to talk to her for 2 months, and she said, you ought to. I used to love the way you sang "Silent Night" when you were a baby. He'd grown up in foster care, and so he was singing "Silent Night" for his mother, Jonathan Nobles was. And when he got to the words "mother and child," all the air blew out of his chest, and it wasn't. It looked pretty fucking violent to me. His glasses, it was so violent that his glasses, big, heavy, plastic glasses, prison-issue glasses, bounced off of his head, landed on his chest, and landed on the floor. And then he didn't move again. I know it hurt. By the time he died, he had changed so much. I spent all day the next day taking flowers around to prison employees that John had wanted to send flowers to, and they were friends of John. He was the most hated guy in the prison when he got there. His nickname was literally the asshole. And the guards hated him, all the other inmates hated him, but he changed, and I watched it happen. And if someone in our fucking penal system in this country changes that much, we need to keep those guys alive and study them. You don't have to let him back out again. John didn't want to be back out. He did something really, really horrible, and he didn't want to be back out here with us again. That was his biggest fear. And by the time he died, he was ready to do it. He was sick of being there. Death row in Texas in those days was in a place called Ellis Unit 1, and it was. It's now they've moved it to a newer place that at least has air conditioning. And think about that. That sounds like no big deal for a murderer. It's a place, a 4-tier, unit in Texas, in South Texas, with no air conditioning. Is what else was. The guy that was retarded died at 9 there while I was in the building. It's a matter of us taking care of ourselves, us taking care of Actually, I wrote this for a movie that Tim Robbins made called Dead Man Walking. The guy by speaking to you as an artist. I was fresh out of the service back in '82. Days that came knocking back to town. When it to be all I could be, come home. Very dawn. that. Yeah, and that's great. And right now, until they get their lethal injection, protocol sorted out. But no, that's huge. And I love living in a state. I lived in Tennessee, which was a state that had the death penalty, but hadn't gotten around to executing anybody, yet for a long time. And now they've executed, 4 people. So, and here, we haven't gotten around to it yet. But yeah, those things are huge. And keep in mind, wrongful convictions, are a huge part of why we're examining the death penalty now exactly the same way we did in the late 50s and early 60s. The peak of executions in this country was during the 30s, during the Depression. Poor people were there were people that they had no jobs and they couldn't, crime was at this incredibly high rate, and people were terrified, and we started executing more and more people, some of which probably, were really bad people, and some were probably just poor. I know one thing. You can count the number of rich people that have been executed in the United States on one hand, maybe. And it's just always been that way. It's just the way our justice system works. And until we have a justice system that's completely and totally impartial in every way, which don't hold your breath. I mean, it's hard for anybody to do. Then my opinion's always been that it doesn't, have, if it can't be, super competent, then it doesn't have any business having the power of life or death. And it's really that simple. And it is, like I said, it's about what it does to us. It makes us, trust me, people think we're fucking barbarians all over the world. We're the only place that there are other places and cultures where it's accepted. Most of Asia, they have the death penalty. It's weird. Their take on it's like in Vietnam, China, you're more likely to be executed for trafficking in drugs than you are murder. Murder's actually, okay up to a certain point in those countries. I don't know why it's complete and total cultural difference, but every place else, I'll tell you why people in Europe are opposed to the death penalty. I think I know the answer to that one. They saw a government get completely and totally out of control and kill millions of its own citizens. And they just think the best way to prevent that from ever happening is not to give a government the power of life and death ever again. And that's why there is no death penalty anywhere in the countries that were directly involved, in Europe in World War II. They just think that's why we can take care of that. The government isn't allowed to do that anymore. Mm-hmm. I've known Lucinda since well, I'm a gentleman. I was 17. I won't tell you how old she was, but I was 17 at the time. We've known each other literally since we were teenagers. What happened is Lucinda made her first few records with a gentleman named Gerf Morlix, who's also an old friend of mine. He was a guitar player, and he produced the records before Car Wheels. He recorded a version of Car Wheels. The entire record had been recorded, with the exception of maybe one song. And she was just having trouble finishing it for whatever reasons. And they did throw that version of it away. Then we recorded the version that's out, all of those tracks. Then I got to the end of the period that I had to devote to it. I had to go back out on the road. And the record wasn't quite finished. There were some vocals she needed to do, and it hadn't been mixed. Several other people worked on it and overdubbed a lot of stuff on it. At the end, they finally took everything that had been recorded after it left my hands off, and then Jim Marshall mixed it. So the Twang Trust is myself and Ray Kennedy. That's the credited producers. And there are other people that worked on it after it left my hands. And there were a lot of rumors about, something happening between Lou and I that caused some sort of blow up, and that it just never happened. We just ran out of time. It's the biggest selling record I've ever produced, and it's probably the best record I've ever produced. And I've produced something that I'm pretty proud of. And we just did, Lucinda did, an album, like these album nights in LA and New York, and the Car Wheels night both times. So she did the whole record. And I did the LA and the New York Car Wheels shows, which was fun because I played on a lot of that stuff too. Because when I play on records, when I produce records, I usually play on them as well. I'm getting ready to start recording. This scares me to death. a Joan Baez record, and it's this is hard. Next year is the 50th anniversary of Joan's first performances at Club 47, and in Cambridge, and that's and we're going to try to do something to commemorate that, and we're going to make a record in Nashville this winter, and I'm scared shitless. Well, I mean, it was one of those things. I used to like. Sometimes I would. It just sort of happened. El Corazon, a lot of people like that record, and it's one of those things. I like that record a lot. It's embarrassing how much I still like to listen to my own records, but there's a lot of really good songs on that record, and the rock band had finally sort of reached this level. The post. I had this sort of vacation in the ghetto, and there's 5 years there almost where I didn't tour and didn't make records. And then when I started doing it, the rock band had sort of matured to a point. I started the bluegrass experiment began with that record. I started hanging out at the station all the time and playing with Del and them, and we did that one track, which really, by the time I finished the tour that supported El Corazon, I'd written, I'll never forget, I told Del the day we recorded, I still carry you around on that record. I said, if I wrote a record of all new bluegrass songs, would you record it with me? He said, yeah. And he just didn't think I would do it in 6 months. So we were in the studio 6 months later. So I'm really proud of it. I sometimes I wished I could focus my records more, and I think the bluegrass record was partially an attempt to do that. But it freaked people out. It's funny. It's like, there were several rock radio stations that had played me for a long time. Even when I was making records that were supposed to be country records, wouldn't play. That's got banjos on it. I'm like, well, what part of bluegrass did you not understand? It's one of those. But bluegrass is really that's me getting out of my comfort zone in a big way by the time I get to the mountain, because it's really hard music. It's the hardest music. I still play it, and I've got a great bluegrass band now, and we're going to make another record with the Bluegrass Sticks, which is Tim O'Brien and Daryl Scott and Casey and Dennis Crouch. It's a great band. It deserves a whole record of its own. But El Corazon is one a lot of people like, and there is a lot of stuff going on. Probably there are some people that are uncomfortable with my records getting that diverse, and sometimes I don't read a lot of what's written about my stuff because it's not. I learned a long time ago that you're in danger of either getting your feelings hurt because you are going to take it personally if people don't like it. Because when people don't like, if you're an artist and people don't like your art, they are not liking you to a certain extent. I mean, you shouldn't take it that way, but it is you. Out there, and so it's hard not to. And if it's good, what they say, you're in danger of believing it, and that can really fuck you up. So I try not. I mean, sometimes I can't avoid it. Like that, I saw the review of the town hall show because I forgot. It's 2 days after the reviews, 2 days after the show in the New York Times, and I just half asleep and went, uh-oh. And once you see the picture, you're gonna read it. So it's, but I try to avoid it. But I've been criticized for my records being too diverse several points in my career. Yuma, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that record. The good news is that's going to be a little more widely available. It looks like he's very close to a record deal, which you'll probably see that record reissued, a lot more widely available in a new record that he'll probably start recording before Christmas. Justin Earle is my son. He's 25, and he fingerpicks, really well. He's got a thumb like a jackhammer, and he still doesn't know exactly what he wants to be. One minute he wants to, make a honky tonk record. The next record he wants to make, and he hasn't, just get the first record made, dude. But he's like me, and he's got a head like a brick bat. But he's in Spain right now. He's in Barcelona tonight, and he's over there touring by himself. He's doing really good, and I'm really proud of him. I can't tell him anything. He just isn't going to listen. There's no doubt about it. But you're going to see a full length Justin record sometime in 2008. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's nobody. First off, let's establish one thing: I'm not a Democrat. I mean, I've always supported Democratic candidates because I'm not going to support Republican candidates. I'm a socialist living in a country with no viable socialist party as it relates to our electoral system. I don't. My way of dealing with that, like I never went for the Nader thing strictly because I had problems with Ralph Nader. It had nothing to do with like lesser evilism or splitting the vote. It was just I felt like he was sort of just as addicted to being right in his own way as George W. Bush was in his, and that's just what I felt like. So I just never could get behind him. And I work with the Greens all over the world, against the death penalty, for instance, because they help raise money for the death penalty, anti-death penalty movement in the United States. The Green Party is really huge on that. So probably the Green Party probably comes closest to the way that I really, I really think than almost any other party that's actually managed to field a candidate. But right now, what makes a Democrat, I'll support some Democratic candidate in some way, shape, or form. It's probably what will happen unless something, lands here from another planet that I haven't anticipated between now and the election. I don't. I have problems with Hillary Clinton because I think she's a Republican. I think she's even more of a Republican than her husband, who I also thought was a Republican. And I don't say that being mean. I just don't think Democrats like Bill and Hillary Clinton. I don't think it's anything. I don't think it's about being evil or not being evil. I just think they're the reason that people in other countries laugh at us when we think there's a difference between Republicans and Democrats. It's more people. I'm a socialist. More people were dumped off of the welfare rolls during the two Clinton administrations and the two Reagan administrations. You can go on and on about Ronald Reagan and conservatism all you want to, but functionally and the way it changed our lives, as far as any sort of social welfare system, which is important to me, the Clinton years did much more damage. But there is a difference in what happens during a Democratic administration and a Republican administration. This is why I end up voting for Democrats. It's look what's happened to the Supreme Court. They do appoint different judges, and when it comes down to any hope of there ever being any real change in this country, the way our Constitution works, you have to think about that. Abortion is going to be fucking illegal in this country. It's going to happen. There's nothing that can stop it now but these relatively young conservative judges dying. It's probably it's gonna be like the death penalty. There's at least going to be a window in there where a woman will not be able to get an abortion in this country. And nobody thought that women getting abortions was a good idea when the laws were changed. They were changed after millions of women dying and being butchered because the reality was that women got abortions when they had unwanted pregnancies, and that's what it was always about. And other people that feel really strongly about it have interjected themselves into politics. So to me, a Democrat that I can get behind is usually someone that something happened in their life that galvanized them. Franklin Roosevelt, that ran for president and certainly in later administrations, was not the same guy that ran for governor of New York. Not the same man. Bobby Kennedy, I think, was going to be a great president, but that wasn't the same. He started out as a rich asshole, and he changed because things happened to him. And what happened? He lost brothers, and he had, he came of age as a politician during the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. So that's what I'm waiting for. I wait for somebody to distinguish themselves. I'll end up supporting, somebody. Obama actually impressed me for about 30 seconds when he actually did come out and said, he came out and said, we need to get out when not 6 months from now, not a year from now, but now. But now that's vanished. That rhetoric it's like he never said it. It's completely and totally vanished off the face of the earth. This election, to me, is about the war. Everything stops until we stop the fucking war. That's what I want to hear about. I mean, all of the other stuff is still going on. It went on the whole time we've been killing all these kids and all of these people in Iraq. And to me, it's about the war. I'll support the first candidate that comes out, absolutely with no exceptions, no reservations against the war. The opposite was true more often than that. I mean, in England, nobody knew who the McCurries were. No, never. I mean, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to keep you accurate so you don't fuck your theory up. But it's just because bluegrass is the biggest selling bluegrass record in the world is still smaller, less records than I sell. So it's just numbers. It's just the way that it is. Holy shit. You'll believe anything, won't you? No, it wasn't. Not one that was there anyway. Del McCurry and I made a record together called The Mountain. The musicians were given an option at the beginning of it. I mean, I made a deal with Del. I said, I can either split the royalties on this with you, or I can pay everybody double scale, and then we'll work out the money however, and then we made a separate deal for the tours. They opted to be paid up front, and so that's what happened. He tried to get me to pay him, and he would pay his guys. I wouldn't do it that way because it's illegal, and but that's how he pays his guys. It's common in bluegrass music. It's just the way they do it. What happened was, the story is that Del became upset about my language on stage because I said, I say motherfucker and stuff, so it got down to that, and that may be true. He may not be completely and totally comfortable with that language, but what caused us to stop touring together was money and billing. Basically, Del went on strike right before the David Letterman show and before a European tour that I had booked, and I was getting ready to lose a lot of money, because what happens if you cancel shows with no good cause is you pay back all of the advertising money and you return the deposits, which would have, for me, I don't make that much money, so it would have ruined me. And chasing to the airport, I think that was actually my manager did go to the airport. Dale quit at a show in Nashville, at a festival in Nashville. I had no idea that it happened. I already drove to my house and I was halfway out there, but my manager did follow Dale to the airport where he was flying out to another show to talk to him about it. And the upshot of it, we gave them 20 more minutes in the show, which was kind of a disaster because it got to be a little more than a lot of the audiences could deal with. It's a little bit. We had a really cool show. It was a cool show, and we gave him more money. And then he agreed to do the European tour. I immediately, by that time, he kind of pissed me off, so I hired Tim O'Brien and them to finish the U.S. tour when we got back. Since then, I see them all the time, and I get along with them fine. But it was about money and about billing. It wasn't anything to do with my language when it came right down to it. Yeah. Right. As far as the change that's happening in the music business, I've never, number one, how people buy music is not my idea of a political issue anyway. Nobody dies, so, but it is changing. Now, I don't sell any less records than I did 10 years ago, and I think it's just the kind of records I make. People are still willing to buy records. This is my belief. If you make art that people absolutely is indispensable, then people that can afford it will pay money and support you for making that art. And people that can't afford it, I just assume they had it for free. And I love the idea that my son made Yuma, for nothing. I mean, he made it for. He got the money from me, but it wasn't very much money. And he set it all up, and it was a figure he could get his head around, and he could do it. And you can literally, it's much more democratic than it was. So it does work both ways. As far as the political part of it goes, all we have to do to be able to say whatever we want to in art is don't censor ourselves. You know, you'll find an audience, and you know what? It's something you can do badly. You know, you can communicate in political terms in music and other forms of art and do it really badly. And if you're doing it badly, you'll find out that you're doing it badly, and then you just adjust and fire again. You know, it's one of those deals. But I think overall, this is pretty healthy. What's happening right now? It means that. Look, artists are not. I don't think artists are taking responsibility for the fact. I don't think that there's as many records being sold because a lot of the records suck. I don't think records now are as. I'm probably just an old fart, but I don't think the records overall are as good as the records that I grew up listening to. Yeah. Well, there's kids out there too. Right. Right. Willie Mason, you know, number one. And Willie Mason's a songwriter. He actually, I think, lived in the Village with his parents until he was, you know, like 8 or 9 or something like that. And I think they're in Martha's Vineyard is where they ended up and where he grew up. And he's like, because his parents were both musicians and because, you know, he was exposed to, and this is a prejudice of mine. Keep this in, the kid can really finger pick, you know, and you know, Justin can finger pick. And, but Justin's not writing as well as Willie is at this point, you know, and he's getting better every single time I see him. He's already selling like 2 nights at Shepherd's Bush Empire, which is 1,300 or 1,400 seats. So that's, you know, in London. And, you know, here, he's managed to get a record deal that's funded fairly well based on publishing in Europe, you know, which is a new model that some people are coming up with. I mean, he's stumbled into some of this stuff, I'm sure, but the songs have gotten better all the time, and he does stuff that's like completely and totally, you know, sounds like something I could have written, you know, like 10 years ago or 15 years ago or 20 years ago. But he does other stuff that's like so new model that it's not even funny. And I think he's really exciting. And there's a lot. I think you're going to see a resurgence in this kind of stuff. I think, you know, a lot of us, you know, I spend a lot of time. Artists have to make choices. I mean, I probably could sell more records if I wasn't. You know, some of the records I make are too loud for you know, for people that are my age, and you know, but that I can't let that stop me from making those records. Right now, this record, by the way, that I just made isn't too loud, but that doesn't mean I won't make another one again. You know, I like to play really ridiculously loud sometimes, and but it's I think the dust is just starting to settle after a big, huge change that's coming. But Willie Mason, you can go out and buy that and take it to the bank tomorrow. He's making. I can't wait for his next record. It's you know, there's a lot of stuff that I do listen. I listen to almost every kind of music that exists, except for, you know, I never have been able to figure opera out and you know, a couple of other things. And my jazz is I'm sort of Arrested Development. I sort of kind of stop with, you know, really hard bop and West Coast stuff is about as far as I got for that. You know, I like stuff that still has melody. Doesn't mean I think that the other stuff's bad. It's the stuff I understand. I think the last like sort of modern jazz record that was a real leap forward that I really, really loved is that Birth of the Cool stuff, that One Miles band, and because I like songs and there's still tunes there. You know, I'm a songwriter. That's probably why that is. But yeah. Yeah. It's close, yeah. It's close to being finished. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think a lot lot of it has to do with, I started painting when I was 50 years old. And, you know, it took me a long time to figure this out. It was inspired mainly by a guy named Tony Fitzpatrick, who's an artist who does all my record covers the last 10 years, all those drawing collages and etchings that are on the cover of my record. And a guy named Terry Allen, who's a songwriter and a sculptor. And he's the reason that Joe Ely and Butch Hancock and all those guys are so fucked up, because he was their art teacher. And he's like, I remember I had just finished, Doghouse Roses had just come out. Carlo was getting ready to do, the Nashville production of Carlo was getting ready to go up. And, you know, I was starting on the novel. I had a new record coming out, and I ran into Terry somewhere, and he asked me what I was doing, and I told him all that stuff. He said, cool, man. Don't you do any visual art? And he thinks that's the way that it should be, and that finally sunk in. So that's what it's about. Two things. Don't ever think you're going to see me run for office, and don't ever think you're going to see me become directly involved in politics in that way, because one of my heroes and one of my role models is John Reed, and it's about what he did, and it's about what he did right, and it's about what he did wrong. And you know, he probably could have changed the world in a way that we can't even imagine if he had understood how powerful what he wrote was. It was a time when journalism was art, and you know, nobody argued about that. There was a real high level of journalism that he helped invent, and he got bogged down in trying to do something that he wasn't quite as good at, which was make policy in the traditional sort of ways that politicians make politics. I also know that this is my day job. And, you know, the reason the novel's not finished, I wanted to finish it before I made this record, but I just didn't quite get there. And, you know, we put Carla up here in New York, and that took some time. And I'll probably write more plays than I do anything else after I finish this novel. I'll probably start concentrating on theater. That was one of the reasons for moving here. A world-class city, you know, has to have public transportation, preferably 24 hours a day, live theater, live original music, you know, a great library. You know, those things are necessary. It's one of the reasons that live theater is like really, really, really important to me. It's my favorite thing about living here is I see a lot of plays, and it's just so. And the other thing is a play. An old-fashioned 90-minute one act is like, you know, 50 pages, and it fits a little bit more in my lifestyle and gets me back to making another record a little faster than a novel. So.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.